In this section, we are going to go over verbal behavior and the 6 types of Skinner's elementary verbal operants. The concept of verbal behavior was created by B.F. Skinner. Verbal behavior is behavior that gets reinforced through another person's behavior. For instance, waving to your friend and then waving back to you. What is verbal behavior? Verbal behavior is any type of communication that supports individuals get across what they want to say. Verbal behavior is also a way that people communicate for their wants and needs or avoid undesirable things. With verbal behavior, we are focusing on the response, not so much the topography. Verbal behavior can include vocal and non-vocal behaviors, such as sign language. Verbal behavior involves a speaker and a listener, where the speaker has control over the behavior and gains access to the reinforcement by the listener's response. Private events fall under the category of radical behaviorism described by B.F. Skinner in 1945. Verbal behavior that occur is controlled by private events. The only complex issue about private behavior is that this is a type of behavior that other people, such as behavior analysts, cannot observe because they are internal. Verbal operants are the unit of analysis in verbal behavior where you have a motivating operation to receive a response and consequence emitted by someone else. Each verbal operant may cause different effects or share common antecedents or consequences. The next slide will go over all 6 types of verbal operants. There are 6 different verbal operants that fall under verbal behavior: echoic, mands, tax, interverbals, transcripts, and textual. Before we go into each of the verbal operants, I'm going to first talk about point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity that some of these verbal operants share. Certain verbal operants involve point-to-point correspondence. When a verbal stimuli and the response of the listener share the same identical beginning, middle, and ending, then that verbal operant share point-to-point correspondence. For instance, if you're working with your client and you say out loud the word airplane, and your client either repeats the word right after he says airplane, then that verbal operant shares point-to-point correspondence. They must look and or sound exactly the same. Once we start to go over each verbal operant individually, we will discuss which verbal operants share point-to-point correspondence. Formal similarity is when the response of the listener share the same sense mode as the antecedent stimuli, as well as looking the same. Let's say you hear someone yell boo, and you yell boo the same exact way. These stimuli are visual, tactile, or auditory, and they physically look the same. The first verbal operant we are going to discuss is echoic. This is also known as verbal imitation. Simply just think of echo to remember this verbal operant. This is a type of verbal operant that involves 2 speakers in order to repeat or echo the verbal stimuli. The echoic operant is controlled by a verbal discriminative stimuli. Simply, the speaker will vocally say cow, and the listener will respond by saying cow. Echoic verbal behavior also produces generalized conditioned reinforcement. Generalized conditioned reinforcement can simply be attention from the speaker or social praise. With echoic training, this is when you have functional control of the verbal responses under verbal discriminative stimuli that have point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity. Shaping is super important when teaching echoic training because you want to make sure you are reinforcing all successful approximations for each echoic. Let's say we are teaching the word cat. As a client progressively starts to pronounce the word cat, you want to reinforce that first successful approximation, which would be the k sound. As you continue to teach and reinforce each approximation, this will help the client successfully say the word cat is met. Manding is a verbal operant that is controlled by a motivating operation, which is something that is motivating and you want it. With manding, think of command. You are demanding something that you want or need. When the speaker is manding, the item that they are manding for is their reinforcement. For instance, if the speaker is manding water and his mom gives him water, the water is the reinforcement. Remember, mands are controlled by motivating operations, not discriminative stimuli. Mands typically will develop in the early stages of children. When babies cry, they have a different cry for certain things, such as being hungry or being tired. As typically developing children get older, they will soon use words or sign language to communicate their wants and needs. Tags are evoked by nonverbal discriminative stimuli. For instance, seeing a bird in the sky. Think of contact. The person is labeling something they see. The speaker identifies features of what they see in their environment. Tacting is just labeling and naming things among their environment. What does tacting look like? Let's say that you and your client are outside walking and he sees an airplane and says airplane. That is tacting. He is simply labeling what he is seeing. The speaker will see the nonverbal stimulus and responding by labeling that nonverbal stimulus while receiving some nonspecific reinforcer. Here are some examples of different types of text. Remember, things are events that one can name or label. That could be features such as color, smells, sounds, or textures, or objects such as people or things, as well as actions like walking, running, or jumping. Next, let's talk about intraverbals. Intraverbals are evoked by other verbal stimuli, such as answering a question, responding to another speaker, or engaging in a conversation. For example, when somebody asks, "What is your name?" the learner will respond and say, "Brian." Another example of an interverbal is finishing a sentence or filling in the blank of a sentence. If someone says, "Twinkle, twinkle, little blank," the learner will respond by saying star. Intraverbals are verbal operants where the speaker is saying something different from the listener. For example, asking a question. Intraverbals are controlled by verbal discriminative stimuli that evokes a verbal response that does not have a point-to-point correspondence, meaning they will not look or sound the same. Intraverbals also produce generalized condition reinforcers. When teaching intraverbals, it is important to utilize shaping and prompt fading. Try starting with fill in the blanks, WH questions, common associations, etc. It is also helpful to teach in natural environments while focusing on activities or items that the client is interested in. Next, let's go over textual. This is when the learner can simply read and understand the written text. This has a point-to-point correspondence, but no formal similarity between the stimulus and the response. Let's look at the example. The stimulus will be one mode, such as a visual card with the written word cow. The response will be a different mode, such as auditory. The response matches the visual stimuli. There are three key factors that a echoic and textual verbal operants share. They're both controlled by an antecedent verbal stimuli. They both have point-to-point correspondence, and they both produce generalized condition reinforcement. Lastly, there is transcription, where the learner could write or spell out a spoken word and take dictation. This verbal operant has a point-to-point correspondence, but also no formal similarity. Let's check out the example. When the learner is asked to spell cat, the learner responds by writing CAT. The spelling of cat is the transcription.